I expect many of you have wondered, as I have, whether Christian Science really fits in a global conversation, and if it does, how does it fit in this conversation? I'm going to show how my own lifelong commitment to finding answers to this question guided me to the Annotated Bibliography on Christian Science, and this can explain some of the thinking behind a bibliography. No doubt, if you have wondered about this question, Christian Science fitting in the global conversation, you've also been in a situation when you've had to explain Christian Science to somebody who knew nothing about it. Sometimes I did a pretty good job of it, but wow, other times not so great. After I became a Christian Science practitioner, I was eager to join my local clergy association and start the conversation there. I was sure they'd be glad to hear, since they obviously didn't know anything about it. Well, the silence in the room was deafening every time I tried to get a word in edgewise. After years of this terrible awkwardness, something finally happened that answered my question and reset the trajectory for my life. My daughter had been away at Harvard Divinity School, working on her master's degree there. She came home during a Thanksgiving break and was interested in joining the Thanksgiving Eve service put on by our local clergy association. During the fellowship that followed the service, I was stunned to watch her engage in conversation with the same clergy I had failed to connect with at all. It dawned on me as I watched her that she had learned their language while she was at divinity school, and I didn't know it at all. And then it clicked. If I was really serious about finding Christian Science in the conversation in the world, I absolutely needed to learn their language. So by January of that year, which was 2001, I enrolled in my local seminary, Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. I was stunned again, this time by what I didn't know. I really had grown up in a bubble I hadn't noticed. Lots of people around me while I was growing up were Christian Scientists, and I was convinced when the world woke up, they'd finally recognize Christian Science as the answer they were looking for. Needless to say, it didn't go that way. It's pretty obvious that we have witnessed a steady decline of Christian Science in the global conversation. Since I entered that seminary classroom, I've spent the last 20 years thinking about if or how Christian Science might truly fit in the great conversation. I had to start with a very humbling lesson. I learned that somewhere along the line, our secret thoughts really do come out. I had to ask myself if I believed or didn't believe that everyone would ultimately come around to my religious views in the long run. In other words, I'm right and they're wrong, and the conversation I envisioned was actually my showing them the right answer. In other words, was I really arrogant inside and just trying to be politely hiding it? How could I sincerely expect to engage in real conversation if my internal conversation was waiting to tell them I knew something better than whatever they were trying to say? I finally began to actually listen with respect. I began to hear the sincerity, beauty, and depth of others' Christian journeys that I'd never paid attention to before. A few months after I graduated, I was in a position to participate in direct conversation between the Mother Church and the National Council of Churches, or NCC. Reverend Dr. Michael Kinnaman, then president of the National Council of Churches, invited me to attend their board meetings as a guest, representing the Mother Church. And shortly afterward, I was appointed as head of ecumenical affairs for the Mother Church. In that capacity, I served on the Faith and Order Commission of the NCC, that's its theological wing, and was invited to present papers on Christian Science and how we fit in the ecumenical conversation. One of the biggest lessons I learned there was that our topics of interest are not necessarily theirs. They were discussing topics we rarely discussed in our periodicals and lectures. So I began to write on their topics. For instance, I wrote an article on the Christian Science view of the environment and another one on mass incarceration. Both of these were published in ecumenical publications. Another big step for me was my conversation with CESNER, an international organization that studies new religious movements. Christian Science falls under the category of new religious movements, or NRMs, in terms of academic religious studies. I guess you'd say it's a kind of replacement for the word cult. I gave talks for them, that is CESNER again, not on my agenda of teaching them Christian Science, but what they were interested in. One of these NRM scholars, Dr. George Chrysidis, introduced me to the University of Birmingham in England, where I finally found a place to do my PhD work. Even though I'm now no longer working in England, George stays in touch, and just a couple of months ago, he asked me to write another article on Christian Science. This time, it was about the Christian Science attitude toward COVID, and that article will come out later this fall. And then another really important relationship at CESNER began to grow. Dr. Gordon Milton, one of the leading scholars on the study of Christian Science, told me, after one of my presentations, that somebody from Christian Science really needed to provide an annotated bibliography on Christian Science resources. Gordon is the retired Distinguished Professor of American Religious History with the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University. He said, and I already knew, that Christian Science is one of the least understood and studied religions in America. And it's partly our fault. We were making it very difficult for scholars to find information and to study it. I said, yes, that's a good idea, and left it at that. The next year, after I gave another paper, Gordon emphasized his point more strongly. I agreed more strongly. The next year, he told me seriously that someone really needed to create an annotated bibliography on Christian Science. It was just too hard to find good resources. Yeah, I know, I said. You ought to have someone at the church take it up, he said. Right, I said. Guess what he said the next year? Someone really ought to do an annotated bibliography on Christian Science. Biographies on Mary Baker Eddy are plentiful, but the history of Christian Science is still obscure and difficult to track down. Then he added, an annotated bibliography would enable scholars to find appropriate resources for their research, and this scholarly research would accomplish much toward a better understanding of this important religious movement. I knew he was right. Back in 1948, about 73 years ago, Henry Steiger had said, even if we expect a scholar to pass correct judgment on a subject within his field of investigation, we cannot expect him to gather this information without assistance. The Christian Science movement cannot expect fair treatment of its doctrine unless from its own ranks efforts are made to lay the necessary groundwork. Evidently, we didn't really hear him because we didn't do anything to help scholars gather the information they were looking for. Then, 34 years later, in 1982, Martin Marty tried again. Until Christian Science leaders open their archives, they will have to content themselves with speculative works of this sort. We still weren't very interested in listening to this. It took another 20 years before the Mary Baker Eddy Library finally opened the Mother Church archives and welcomed the scholars. This was a major step forward and was crucial for Christian Science to engage in the world conversation. And then even 15 years later, Gordon was telling me that the scholars also needed an independent bibliography. It took me another 5 years before I finally began to connect my prayer about Christian Science fitting in the global conversation with what Gordon was telling me. And I finally consented to the rightness of the idea. Then I began looking for anyone who would be willing to help. God was graciously preparing us, as the saying goes, and I finally found my two outstanding colleagues, Linda Bergman and Helen Mathis, who also caught the spirit of the assignment. We three began the work, thinking it might take us a whole year to put this together. Fortunately for us, Linda has an incredibly huge personal library of thousands of books pertaining to Mrs. Eddy and the history of Christian Science. Helen has a master's degree in biblical studies, and she's an excellent writer. So, putting all of our resources together, we devised a system for finding, organizing, reading, and writing 200-word annotations on everything we could find. After a year, we were still finding more items that needed to be organized and added to our ever-growing pile of items that needed attention or needed annotation. So I told Gordon it was taking longer than expected, but we'd be done sometime the next year. By the end of the second year, we were still finding more items, and our piles only continued to grow. By this time, we had over 200 books and articles that we had read and annotated. I piled up the books I was still assigned to read, and they reached almost to my ceiling. I told Gordon, well, it'll be another year. Well, finally we agreed we just had to draw the line in the sand at about 400 references. We're now into our fourth year. Gordon had suggested that we first create a book, a physical book, that we could send to important religion scholars and libraries around the country. And then later we would have to convert it to an electronic source in order to keep it up. On July 16th, last summer in 2021, we launched the book on the day of Mrs. Eddy's bicentennial, 200 years after her birth. This was about our 5th year into the project. Our goal was to get the book into the hands of researchers, professors, librarians, and scholars who might be studying something related to Christian Science. Now in our 6th year, we began phase 2, turning the whole work into a website. We needed to completely reorganize the entire structure. Fortunately, we've been working with an outstanding web consultant who helped us rethink the whole project from the perspective of electronic searching, which is quite different from book searching. What about the funding? For the book, we raised exactly what we needed, about $15,000 from a GoFundMe project to get the book printed and distributed where it needed to go. By the time we started preparing for a web application for the book, we knew we would need to incorporate and become a 501c3 nonprofit so that churches, associations, and others could make larger donations. The website is essential to meet our goals for 2 important reasons. One, it's the only way we could make it available internationally, and it's the only way we could keep it updated. We are so grateful that we received just enough for this expensive website development, and now we're preparing to let it operate on into the future. This has been now 6 years. So now, joining with a lot more people thinking this global conversation, we're going to find out together just how Christian Science does fit in the global conversation.